All right. I bet we got to Duke. Is that right? Duke was our last one? All right. So one of our themes here is a rise of these big national brands that we all have grew up with and grown up with for the last 100 years, producing enormous wealth. But the kicker here is the infrastructure, as I was mentioning last time. The infrastructure, completing that railroad infrastructure, really creates the opportunity that people make an enormous amount of money by raising capital to build machinery to then lower the cost of production and then ship it out across the country. Again, if you didn't have low shipping costs, you wouldn't have the reason to invest so much money in machinery. Your next ID is Gustavus Swift. Not unlike another guy named Philip Armour. They both are the first people to move into meat packing, as we call it, and the production of meats. The big innovation here is the development of the refrigerated railroad car. Kind of see this early picture. It's using ice tanks on either end. One of the big movements of the West was to produce all of this cattle out in the West, and it's all being shipped to the East. And the big funnel to go to, remember, here is where most of the people in the United States lived then and still today. Deeply compact area, or very high populations here. All these cattle come across to Chicago, and there are these huge stockyards, hundreds of thousands of cattle out there. It's the last best place to buy cows, really cheap, before they go east. Further they go from Chicago east, the price of the cattle go up. So Gustavus Swift, man from Sweden, I believe, has this idea that, wow, if I bought cattle here in Chicago where they're cheap and I slaughtered them here and processed them and put them on refrigerated rail cars, I can then sell them on the East Coast at the price that cows cost on the East Coast, which is higher. He sees a differential in price. So he ends up raising capital to create the first slaughterhouse on a massive scale, mass production. Gets in an immigrant workforce, Lithuanians and Poles and Greeks and all these immigrants who are coming from Europe in the late 19th century. There's no minimum wages, there's no workplace standards, there's nothing. This is a great opportunity for him to use cheap labor and produce meat there. He will do dressed beef, and also pigs are being stockpiled, if you can say, or the stockyards for hogs as well. So he'll dress the meat out and send it east, and then people, butchers and such, and other sellers of meat can come in and get already dressed out meat, and he makes the price differential. I'd like you to also know that they also get into cooking meat and making canned meat. Philip Armour is famous for saying that he used everything but the squeal of a pig. Anything about the pig, the carcass, the entrails, everything was useful as food that could be eaten. And this is where you guys probably have heard of the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and the desire to regulate this stuff. The problem was they would take all the entrails and all the leftover parts and kind of leave them on the factory floor for a while. Rats and such would be running over them. Then they'd pull all this meat and put it in this big vat and cook it. They'd put formaldehyde on top of it and other chemicals to try to kill the botulism. But it often didn't kill all the botulism. But this canned meat was for consumers on the East Coast who couldn't afford to eat. You're shaking your head, right? So poor immigrants in the cities would buy this canned mystery meat. And a lot of them got sick and died, and there was a growing clamor in America to regulate this stuff because people are getting sick and dying. Well, he's back in Illinois. They did have a health system in Illinois that was supposed to look over these things, but this was also the time of corruption, and you could pay bribes to government officials to have them let you know when they're coming by or just look the other way. And so for years and years, this meat would come out of Chicago headed for the east. And it's not until the time of the Progressive Era under Franklin Teddy Roosevelt, remember him, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Meat Inspection Act will finally get some regulations, but he's going to have about 25, 30 years of being able to do this in an unregulated market. This canned meat also gives rise to things like Heinz 57 and ketchup and mustard, things to kind of cover the taste of the chemicals in the food. So we got kind of two themes going on with Gustavus Swift. One is that he's figured out a way to make money on these differentials in price of his raw material, which is the beef. It's also about innovation, which with the refrigerated car, but it's also about the unregulated marketplace and how Americans are going to have to call for and really fight for legislation to protect them. They're going to want to bring, increasingly, you'll see in this part of the class, or this part of American history, that Americans are now having to get federal laws to protect them from these rising corporations and try to get them to operate under better standards. Another good example from this period is Charles Pillsbury. This is a name we know still today, the Pillsbury brand. After the Civil War, Charles Pillsbury went to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Minneapolis is on the Mississippi River. It looks a lot better up there. It doesn't have all the sediment and such. Around falls is where you would mill things. You need falling water to move a water wheel. And there were several mills in Minneapolis that produced flour. Now, one of the reasons he's gone to Minneapolis is because Minnesota and Wisconsin are where our great wheat fields are. It's a little cooler up there. It's the right conditions for wheat. So the cheapest place to buy wheat is going to be where it all funnels in to Minneapolis. Now, what he ends up building is a big modern factory to produce milled wheat, which he'll send out in like 75-pound bags across America. Now, America at that time, there were mills all over the place, and they were very local and or regional mills. They weren't very far. Most Americans bought their flour not very far from where it was milled, maybe within 30 miles. What he is now going to do, because of his ability to buy the wheat where it's cheapest, it comes in on rail cars. He's got a system that siphons out the wheat out of these rail cars, goes up into the top of the factory, and there's all this machinery. The humans don't even touch it. It just goes through all these processes and comes out in these 50-pound bags or 75-pound bags. Now, his flour is much cheaper to make on a unit cost because of the machinery and because of his access to cheaper, large quantities of grain. But if it weren't for the infrastructure of the railroads that brought down the cost of transportation, he couldn't have sent this wheat from here to Alabama and run out of the marketplace local brands. And that's one of the themes that I want you to see. Mills around America go bankrupt. They cannot compete with this flour coming out of these factories in the Northwest. He also uses effective advertising to put advertisements in magazines where his consumers will likely see it. And so you go into a little grocer and maybe there's a local milled flour that's kind of coarse, and then there's his Pillsbury's Best. And you'd say, I think I'll take the Pillsbury. I've been reading about this and it's good price too, and it's great quality. So runs out of the marketplace small producers. And that's the theme here. Small producers of things will be run out of the marketplace because of the concentration of machinery in factories. And this is the age that's coming on. I will say this about Charles Pillsbury. He was evidently he was a capitalist with a heart. He paid his workers good wages. He maybe even had a profit sharing plan with them. Most of the other capitalists during this period have very poor relations with their workers and don't pay very much and have difficulty with them. We're going to be looking at workers and unions in a little while, how they came to be, the struggle they had, the workplace, the strikes and the fighting that went on. Pillsbury was one of the very few capitalists who escaped all that because he treated his workers so well. So another person to know is Cornelius Vanderbilt. And I bring him in to talk about a little something different about what's happening. The Vanderbilt family was from New York, old stock Dutch people from the Netherlands. New York used to be called New Amsterdam when the Dutch settled it, and English took it in about 1740. But the Vanderbilts made their money off of shipping. When shipping was really shipping, they had these schooners, a fleet of schooners, sailboats. They would leave the port of New York, sail down all the way around Chile, and head for China, or head for Europe, and get things and bring them back to New York. After the Civil War, there's like the three of them. The Commodore was the father, and then Cornelius Vanderbilt, his son, convinced his father to sell all their fleet of schooners, sailing ships, and get into railroads, because he saw that the future was going to be making wealth in railroads. And so they sold their fleet and started investing early in railroads. And the Vanderbilts, Cornelius Vanderbilt, becomes probably the biggest holder of railroads as a sole person who really owns most of the corporation stock, becomes among the most wealthy people in America. And that's the theme that I want you to think about here, and it's wealth inequality. Wealth inequality. For the first time in American history, we have some people that are becoming so enormously wealthy. We'd always had wealth differentials, but the differential between a prosperous farmer in New England and maybe a banker, it just wasn't that extreme. For the first time, we've got wealth on a wealth inequality, concentration of wealth in families that we'd never seen before. He's got a big mansion in downtown New York City. They've got other houses up in Providence, Rhode Island, and then they need a summer. His son, who inherits his fortune, decides he could use a summer house. And a lot of people were leaving the cities during the summer because they had about 100,000 horses in New York City, each of them producing about 20 pounds of manure every day and all the urine, and cholera would break out in these hot summer months. And so they would try to get out of the city and go to cool remote areas. And the Appalachian Mountains became a place where wealthy people wanted to come. Y'all recognize this weekend house, the summer house they make? What is it called? Biltmore. The Biltmore, right? So I guess they could have called it the Vanderbiltmore, but they called it the Biltmore. This house is made for Cornelius Vanderbilt's son, his wife, and their 2 children. And we've never seen anything like it. This is a chateau, basically. It remains the single largest family residence in America. And Americans cannot believe the kind of wealth that's being created. And they begin to talk about maybe income tax on the super wealthy, or maybe an inheritance tax on the super wealthy. There's an argument being made that these railroads, etc., were in large part the result of public efforts, public land being given to them, and also the new corporation laws. We had changed the way laws worked to allow for these corporations. And so many Americans are saying it's not fair, this deep wealth inequality. All right, so that's why I wanted you to know Cornelius Vanderbilt. This next one is a different reason I'm bringing him up. His name is Jay Gould. This is a political cartoon that is, they don't like him. I think you can perhaps tell by the way it's drawn that he's not a likable character. He's an example of a corporate raider. A corporate raider. I'll explain what that is. He's an example of a corporate raider. A raider is somebody who goes in and takes other people's stuff, like a Vikings or something. So to explain him, I've got to explain, I just want to look a little bit at corporations. Corporations are owned by the stockholders. They've divided when they raise the capital to buy all the machinery, they raise that capital by selling shares of stock in it. And the stockholders are spread out across America. Now, the stockholders have to get together so often make decisions. And what happens is a board of directors is created. And the board of directors are the largest shareholders in the company. There may be lots of other shareholders around, but they probably don't show up at these things. Now, the board of directors, they hire the management. And at the top of this is the president. Today we call them CEOs, Chief Executive Officer, or Chief Financial Officer would be another one of the important ones. And so the board of directors picks a president. In a company like what Vanderbilt would own, he would both be the head of the board, and he'd also make himself president. In some of these closely held companies, where the family holds it, or somebody on the family holds it, these oftentimes will be head of the board and also the president of operations. But the job of management is to, I remember hearing, I actually got a bachelor's degree in business before I studied history. And so I remember sitting in my finance class and my professor said, the job of management is to maximize shareholder wealth. End of story. So I'd like y'all to come away with that idea, to maximize shareholder wealth. That is to maximize your profits. The profits get redistributed to the owners of the company. I should go ahead and mention the role of bonds. Corporations have the owners who own the stock, but bonds are basically when a corporation borrows money. They issue a bond which states a term. It's a loan basically. It's a loan to the company. Has the term and the percent that will be paid on this loan to the company. All of these corporations borrowed a lot of money to get the machinery to get going, so they issued these bonds. And these bonds have a payment that's due on a schedule. And if the bonds can't be paid, then the corporation is bankrupt. And the bondholders can sue in court to have the company assets sold. And whatever the bondholders can get, they take away whatever they can. Maybe they had invested $100 million, but you sell all the assets and it's only $20 million. So you're only getting 20% of what the bonds were originally worth, but it's a little something. What do the corporations have? What about the stockholders? Do they have anything? At that point in time, they've got nothing. But let me bring us, I want to say two more things. This issue of maximizing shareholder wealth. This means that the management has to keep down costs. And one of the big costs that they face is labor costs. Maybe the biggest cost they face is this bond, and this is going to get them in trouble. But a lot of presidents of these corporations won't care very much about their workers. There will be no minimum wage. There will be no workplace safety. But all those things cost money. And so we're going to see a period of time when workers are going to be in a pretty bad situation, and they're going to clamor for change. And it's going to take a while before we get anything for workers. Now, to come back to Jay Gould as a corporate raider. We had a lot of booms and busts in American history in the 1870s through 1890s, lots of rising expansion of the economy, expansion of corporations, but they would overexpand and there'd be a bust. What Jay Gould managed to do was to find struggling small companies like railroad companies. They were struggling during the Depression. And you can imagine that the price of their stock has fallen dramatically. He and some other investors who are in cahoots with him would go in and buy enough stock that they controlled the board of directors. By the way that the companies work is if you've got 51%, it's kind of like in politics. If enough stockholders can, rally together and get 51% of them voting the same way, then they control the voting that takes place on the board of directors or the stockholders' meetings. He and his friends went in, bought enough stock to make them have 51% so they could control what the board did. They would then name Jay Gould as the president. Then Jay Gould would get these same friends of his, and he would name them on the management, like chief of operations and things like that. And then what they would do is to sell off the assets of the company. And he mostly did this in railroads. So you would sell off engines, you'd sell off cars, you'd sell off whatever you could get a hold of, you'd sell. Now those assets belong to the shareholders, right? And at the end of the day, they even kind of belong to the bondholders. But he would sell all this stuff because nobody was looking over his shoulder. There was no regulation of this. He's even famous for counterfeiting shares of stock and showing up and saying, here's my shares of stock that give me this vote. Also would even arrange for shareholders that were coming to a meeting to prevent them from getting there by using detectives and such to slow them up, because the things that happen in that meeting bind the company. And it's just strange things that y'all probably don't have any much knowledge of. But you would use a variety of shenanigans to get hold of companies and then ruin them, absolutely ruin them. Because he and his friends would sell off the assets, pocket it in their own accounts, and then they would leave the thing in ruins and go on. And there were no laws to prevent this sort of, it's almost like the Wild West. New corporations in the 1870s to 1890s, it's a kind of a new land. But finally, I would say for you that he gives capitalists a bad name, is what I think I see in the tests. Investors hate him, bondholders hate him, people that worked for his company, and it was their livelihood, and now the company's been ruined by him. They all hate him. But he's operating because he just cares about himself. Experiences of people like Jay Gould is going to lead to calls for new laws to try to control this field. And I'm going to also say that despite the laws that we put on the books, over time, wealthy people without scruples end up figuring out other ways to work around it. Has anybody heard of Enron? In the 1990s, the big energy company? We'll be talking about that at the end of the semester. In fact, when we get to the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, we see kind of a replay of the Gilded Age when we have pretty unscrupulous people who are willing to do whatever it takes to make as much money as they want and not really be concerned about the implications for investors and also the workforce. The most famous of those is a guy named Ken Lay. All right, who do we have next? We got J.P. Morgan. Y'all heard of J.P. Morgan? You've heard of the company J.P. Morgan probably. It actually started with an individual named John Pierpont Morgan. This is his bank on Wall Street. What you want to put down for him is he probably our first important investment banker, an investment banker. You would invest your money in his bank, and he would turn around and make stock purchase for you, bond purchases for you, because he's on Wall Street. He's a couple doors down from where stocks and bonds are bought and sold. Do y'all know where stocks and bonds are bought and sold? Exchanges, by the way, are where on the national, international level, people exchange things. Out in Chicago, it's the commodities exchange for like food and cattle and grains and things like that. In New York City, it's the New York Stock Exchange, right? So he's right down from the New York Stock Exchange, and he can go down and make these purchases for investors. His most important clientele is English investors. I think I told y'all before that America was a beneficiary of about $8 billion in foreign investment in the late 19th century, buying mostly bonds. in American railroads and corporations. If you wanted to buy, and the reason he became such a great representative of English is because he had family connections there among the wealthy who were looking for, they need somebody over here in America to carry out their purchases for him. Now, this is him responding to a reporter who's trying to take his picture. He's caning the guy. J.P. Morgan ends up becoming a not well-liked man in America because, as I'm about to explain how, he becomes the main driving force to the consolidation of corporations. He's known as kind of a trust master. There's a phrase you're going to want to come away with from this period. It's called antitrust. Antitrust policy. We're going to get antitrust policies during this period. And what that means is Americans are going to ask for government laws to prevent the coming together of these corporations so that they have monopoly power. The reason it's called antitrust is because the trust, which was a legal instrument to hold assets for like children and others, or maybe a hospital endowment, a trust is just an instrument to hold things. But what they begin to do in the 1870s is they begin to use these trusts to roll the stocks of multiple companies into them. And so you can also, have you heard perhaps of something called a holding company? It's basically a way by which multiple corporations that used to be owned separate institutions combine into one monopoly. And he was the one who brought them together. Now, I got to tell you why he was in a position to do so. We're going to have lots and lots of small railroads at first. You get a group of investors, you look at the market, and you see all these people are moving there, and they've got to move goods around, and you think, I'm going to put a line in. Because what they do is they start looking at the price of what's got to be got to market, and they figure out how much can they charge a ton, what can they expect in the way of movement, and they say, we can make money doing this. So these railroads, here's what I'd like you to know about this, fixed costs, the problem of fixed costs. Railroads, to get going, they issue lots of bonds and they issue some stock, which is ownership. This is ownership of the company. And bonds are a debt of the country. They're just loans to a company. Some people want to become owners of the company, and that's how they capitalize it. You'll have a few men who've gotten together, at this point men who've gotten together and they've issued this stock. They hold most of it for themselves, but they try to get people to buy their stock. And then they issue bonds. And a bond is a promise to pay back all of these loans that people take on. It's got a certain percent, let's say 7%, and it's going to be like a 10-year bond in order to capitalize this thing. So they borrow the money, people have ascribed to it, and they buy all the rail, and they hire the employees, and they build this thing. Now, lots and lots and lots and lots of lines get built. And they begin to compete with each other in the 1870, after the Civil War, 1870 to 1880, we have a tremendous growth of these railroads. And they're just building everywhere because they think the demand for railroads is enormous. But here's a problem that begins to emerge, and that's overproduction. This is your next phrase here, overproduction or oversupply. Too many railroad companies have formed and are offering services in the same little area. Let's say you're in Illinois, and like 5 or 6 different railroads are now servicing the same market. When they all entered the marketplace, they thought there was enough room for all of them. But what ends up happening now is they realize that there's too many lines there. And so the railroad companies have got to compete with each other. How do they compete? On price. You could try service too, but when it comes down to it, it's going to be price, right? So how do you compete on price? You lower your prices. Now what happens if somebody starts offering 5 cents off a ton, right? So what do the other 4 competitors have to do? They've all got to lower their cost. And then, so what does that do to profitability of those companies? They're beginning to drop. And then somebody else says, well, I'll drop again. And so the other groups have to do it. And well, all of a sudden, you've got a huge problem. You've got fixed payments due to your bondholders. If you can't make your fixed bond payments, do you know what has happened to your company? If you can't pay, you are bankrupt. And so what happens is the bondholders get together as a group and they hire a lawyer to take you to a court, and they want the court to declare that company to be bankrupt, and they will sell off all the assets of that railroad. And those assets go to the trustee of the bonds people, and then he sends out as much money as he can to all of the bondholders, right? Now, they don't get all their money back, but they get at least something back. And this is always the fear of the company management and owners, that if they can't make their payments, they're going to lose the whole thing. All right. They have got to stabilize prices. So the first thing they begin to do about their competition is try to have gentlemen's agreements. These 5 railroads that I've given you hypothetically in Illinois, they say, hey, let's all meet in Chicago and have lunch. And so the owners get there and they go, listen, this isn't working. We're all going to impoverish ourselves. Now, the best thing would be is if like 2 of them would just leave, right? Then the market could stabilize. But none of the 5 want to leave. And so they all agree, we will no longer, any of us, go below this amount per ton. And they all leave Chicago, they go home. But now what happens is businessmen begin to backstab each other. They start meeting with people like Rockefeller or whoever's moving a lot of product, and they start offering secret discounts. You use my supply, I'll charge you the public rate of 27 cents a ton, but let's meet privately and I'll give you a discount back, right? You pay 27, and that way I can get your business on my line. So the 5 competitors aren't working together. All right. Now, what happens is they begin to go bankrupt. By the way, the farmers during this period loved it when lots of railroads came in. They saw the downward prices of rail service. But now this is why they end up hating J.P. Morgan. It was in those circumstances that J.P. Morgan emerged as the representative of the bondholders, mostly out of England. He realizes that the problem is there's too many competitors in the marketplace. And so he takes them and rolls them into one company. All right? Once there's one company, are they competing anymore? They're not competing anymore. What happens to the price of rail service in Illinois? It shoots up. And so the farmers in Illinois hate these consolidations because it's costing them a lot of money and they're already in hard times. So I do have this one person I'm going to bring for you, this guy Victor Morowitz. I'll be talking about him a couple of times. He's, y'all have the misfortune of this being my area of expertise and scholarship. I'm currently writing a book on this guy. Give you a quick background on him. Victor Morowitz, son of an immigrant family in Baltimore, Maryland. Came here, I think, in the 1850s. He was 21 when he... So it must have been about 1860 that they arrived. His father was a doctor in Maryland. Age 14, he gets sent to Europe for his studies. Studies at the Sorbonne, studies in Switzerland, several other places. Comes back at age 17. He's got such a great pedigree of studies that Harvard immediately matriculates him, gives him a bachelor's degree, and he goes right into law. Studies law, finishes law at age 20, moves to Chicago, and he looks about 15. He was really small, slight, and he couldn't get any one to hire him. So he asked his father if he would support him for a year while he concentrated on writing a much needed textbook to understand corporation law. More than just a textbook, a guide to understanding corporation law. So he writes this like 700-page book explaining trusts and corporations, and it becomes the standard for corporation law. It helps people understand it. Well, the next thing that happens for him is that he comes to the attention of Andrew Carnegie, and then he becomes Andrew Carnegie's personal lawyer. But then when J.P. Morgan needs to roll out all these new consolidations, he literally needs someone to put them together, a lawyer, a corporate lawyer. And he becomes, so here's what I guess you could put down for him. He becomes the premier mind, the leading mind on corporation law in America during this period. He understands how to make these new big conglomerations. And by the way, we're coming up now on the Wabash Railroad Company versus Illinois and the Interstate Commerce Act. All right. If you are a farmer in Illinois, and there are those 5 railroad companies have formed between 1870 and 1880, and they begin to compete with each other and lower their prices, what do you think? Awesome. That's fantastic. See, nothing but better. But now that this consolidation has taken place, what's going to happen to the rates? They go back up. In fact, they go higher than what they were because there is no competition in that part of the marketplace. There's only one railroad company now because it's consolidated. And so now what do farmers think? As the prices go up to what they had ever been, they're mad as heck. And they think, what's the problem? Well, what made that possible? It was the combination of these companies. And so now farmers decide, we've got to stop this. We can't let these mergers take place. And that is what this first ID for you is. I know it's down there ways, but the Wabash Railroad Company versus Illinois. This is the Wabash system. The great Wabash. It was the first big combination of a whole bunch of small railroad companies. It gets formed in 1884-85. It's traveling all the way from New York out to the Pacific, but here's this big network in the Midwest. In Illinois, the farmers, Illinois is a big farm state, the farmers' alliances have gotten people elected in the state government there, and they are all reflecting the anger of the farmers. And the farmers say the problem is these mergers, and so the state of Illinois passes a law making it illegal for railroad companies to consolidate into one. They make it illegal for these consolidations to take place. So what does the Wabash Railroad Company think about that? Are they going to be able to let that stand? They're going to fight them. How can you fight a state law? What? Well, the state's already, yes, you can take it to a state court, but the state court might be appointed by a governor who was elected by the farmers. But yeah, if the state won't help you, you're right, states, you go state. But if the state won't help you, you can go federal. Now, the only way that the Wabash Company is able to go federal is because, and here's what it argues, we are an interstate company. We're not just in one state anymore. We're in multiple states. There is something you ought to know from the U.S. Constitution. There is something called the Interstate Commerce Clause. A clause is a part of the Constitution, a particular section. The Interstate Commerce Clause. It's a very important development for American economic history. What this clause said is that only the federal Congress can regulate trade between the states. That's what it says. Only the federal Congress can regulate trade between the states. Regulate, what they mean by that is They did not want tariffs put on between products coming from other states. They wanted a free market. They wanted goods and services to pass freely across the states. Now they know that let me give you an example. New Jersey had lots of land and they had lots of dairy. New York City needed lots of dairy. And so the farmers of New York were supplying dairy to New York City, and so were the New Jersey farmers. What would be the natural inclination of New York farmers who had to compete with New Jersey farmers? Let's put a tariff on all imported dairy coming outside of New York. You can see why the farmers in New York would want to do that, right? It's very natural. And the framers of the Constitution understood that humans could probably get that thing passed. But would that be beneficial? This has been one of the big things. We've allowed for something called competition to determine who are going to be the players in the market. That's the free market of competition, free system. So, according to the Interstate Commerce Clause, only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So, the Wabash Company says, we're an interstate company. Illinois cannot restrain us in this way. So they go to the Supreme Court. This is a Supreme Court decision. Wabash Railroad Company is suing the state of Illinois. I need to give you one more thing. Here's an interesting thing that we do in the 19th century. We decide that corporations have all the rights of an individual person. That was an interesting decision too. We decide that companies are like people. They can sue in court. They can sell things. They can buy things. They can lease things. They're, for all intents and purposes, they're just like any other citizen in the United States. Only they've got a tremendous amount of power, right? And we're about to see the growth of the power of the corporations. Okay, guess who wins this when it goes to the Supreme Court? The company wins. And they strike down the Illinois law, and they say that is unconstitutional, is the phrase they use. So your next ID is about, it's the first effort to regulate a sector of the economy. Farmers in Illinois are mad, right? Because this company is now, and they say, fine, we will then do this. We will regulate companies. This is a political cartoon from the period. It's this farmer trying to warn other people in other states. What's he trying to warn them of? The railroad companies are going to kill you all. This is a dangerous menace to American people. And it's the farmer who's the first trying to ring the bell, say, we've got to be careful. This is actually pretty successful. Farmers in lots of states start haranguing and arguing on behalf of regulation of these companies to stop these consolidations. Now, the representatives, who are the representatives from the different states? We're going to have 2 senators from each state, and then we're going to have people who are popularly elected called representatives. They've got a problem on their hands. They've got lots and lots of constituents in all these states saying, do things about the railroads. But the way that politics were at that time in 1884 was most of the people who were in Congress were close to the railroads. So if you're a congressman, you've got a problem. You've got this massive amount of people who want to go after the railroads. And you've got the railroad owners over here going, don't you dare do anything to harm my business. So what's a poor congressman to do? What's going to happen if he does not do what the people want him to do? He's going to be thrown out. So he'd better do something. But he better not do something that really irritates these people, or they won't have him elected, right? And he owes a lot to these people for his election. And so U.S. congressmen and senators were put upon to do something about the fear that consumers have. That's one of the things that's driving what we called political will. Political will is a very important element to American democracy. You've got to have the people care enough about something that they talk to their congressman, or that they vote on for representatives who are going to carry out these things that they want and they really care a lot about. One of the biggest motivating factors for political will is fear. Fear gets people's attention. And the farmers are trying to get the attention of people and say, these railroads are going to take over our lives. These corporations are going to take over our lives, and we need to do something to constrain them. But as I mentioned last time, the politicians are in a tough spot. They owe their careers. They owe their position to the wealthy. They owe their position to the corporations and the railroads. But they've got the people who want to constrain them. And as I mentioned last time, this is about right where it was. They do pass the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, and it is the first effort on the part of the American people to regulate these new big businesses. But as I pointed out last time, it creates this commission. And here's what I want you to know about something else to write down about the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is created out of the Interstate Commerce Act. This body is very limited in its power. I want y'all to know that. It's very limited in its power. It only has, okay, here's how the process works. A group of shippers in a state, say Illinois, could get together and say, these rates that this railroad is charging is unfair. You're going to have to say they're charging manufacturing only this much money per ton, but they are singling out our area as farmers and charging us more money per mile than others. Now, what you've got to do is get together, hire lawyers, and go to the Interstate Commerce Commission and file an appeal with them. Now, they're going to have to accept applications from all over the country. Now, they're up against a pretty slow process is what's going to happen. For one thing, it's slow. It can only handle a small body of complaints at a time. Number two, they have very limited resources in this department. They're really having to rely on the people who are bringing information to them. The railroad companies have got more lawyers than anyone in America at this point in time. The federal government at that time didn't have many attorneys. I'll talk about that more in a minute when I get to the Sherman Antitrust Act. But here's the next thing that's not very powerful about them. They can only strike down rates. They can only tell a railroad company, if they side with the complainants and say, yes, you're right, this is unfair, all they had to do was the power to strike down those rates and tell the railroad to redo their rate system. So months go by, the railroad rolls out a new rate system, but it's kind of a shell game. They move things around, but they've not really done anything. So the people in that state get upset again, and they go back, but now they're going to get in the back of the line for the ICC. And what happens is this: very little constraint on railroads occurs as a result of the ICC. But remember, the ICC is put forward as something that will protect American people, American consumers and producers, small producers. But in fact, it's just window dressing, as they say. It's just kind of something to, here's another word for you, assuage, if I can spell it. I think that's assuage. If anybody's typing up, is that assuage? Assuage is to reduce the anxiety of someone, to take away their fear, to give in to what they want, make them feel better. This appears to only have been an effort to assuage the anger, tell the people they're doing something, but they don't really do anything. But the next big effort by Americans to control corporations is called the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it's on your ID list. The Sherman Antitrust Act. The trust is the instrument that the investment bankers use to create these conglomerations. The Sherman Antitrust Act gets passed through the Senate. It's named for this guy, Sherman, who brings the bill forward. It's got to pass both the House of Representatives and the Senate. It is amazing what it says. Every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine to conspire with other persons or persons to monopolize any part of trade or commerce among the states shall be deemed guilty of a felony. So we are now trying to stop the development of large corporations by passing this act. Now, who's going to enforce the act? If the legislature passed, by the way, this is a federal piece of legislation, who would be responsible for carrying out the law? Not the Supreme Court. Who is it?
The Federal Trade Commission.
Well, not, okay, what branch? The legislative branch, Congress makes the law. Who enforces the law? Don't know this? It's the president's offices. The executive branch does this. Now, the president himself is not going to prosecute laws. The person who does that is called the Attorney General in the Department of Justice. So the DOJ, the Department of Justice, will be responsible for carrying this out. All right, a couple things I want you to know about this. Well, it would look like there'd be no more big business in America. Are there big businesses in America? No. Were there combinations of monopolies that go forward? Absolutely. So evidently this thing doesn't work. So I want you to know two things about this. Americans are afraid of monopolies. They want to stop them. They pass legislation. They actually get people in the Senate to pass this legislation. But once again, it proves to be meaningless. And it does not stop the development of companies. Two things happen. Number one, Congress does not give the Department of Justice a budget to carry out this function. If you're going to, so Congress does not give them a budget to carry this out. They provide the law, but they don't provide the means. If you're going to prosecute companies for this, you've got to have a host of attorneys general, district attorneys who are dedicated to going after these companies. You've got to hire them, and they've got to have staff. That means you've got to lay out federal money to carry this out, and Congress does not do that. The Department of Justice has got other crimes it's trying to deal with. It's got other issues, and it is not staffed properly. The corporations that they're going up against have the best lawyers and most of the lawyers of America. And so it's simply inefficient and ineffective and unable to carry it out. And the presidents aren't very serious about it. Again, it's something that's supposed to be to assuage the fear of the American people, and it remains very weak for about 20 years. It will eventually be beefed up when people figure this out. Hey, this isn't doing anything. This is some kind of game you guys are playing. The other way it gets weakened is a Supreme Court decision called the United States versus E.C. Knight Company. I think that's on your list, is it as well? E.C. Knight? Is it not? I mean for it to be. I don't think I have my list. Oh. Sherman Antitrust Act. So tie this to that. In 1895, under President Grover Cleveland, what? Yeah, that's the second thing I want you to know about it. A second thing I want you to know because of why it doesn't work to do what the American people wanted it to do. Number one, they don't fund it. That is, the Congress doesn't fund it, and the presidents aren't that interested. We actually do get Democratic President Grover Cleveland in 1894-95. The Department of Justice decides to try to go after a company. And the purpose of the company of this act is to break it up. The Department of Justice goes to the judge and says, this company, the E.C. Knight Company, what the E.C. Knight Company is a sugar refining company. They've got a monopoly in sugar in America. They've gotten control of most of the sugar imports, and they've got production facilities. This is one of their facilities in New Orleans. And that's a later picture. That's the best thing I could find was a postcard. E.C. Knight is this holding company for all these sugar refining manufacturers. And because they control the market, they set the price for the whole market. They're not competing with each other. Competition is gone from that process. E.C. Knight loses in a district court, but they decide to appeal it to the Supreme Court in the United States, in Washington. And so it's the United States is trying to uphold this law that Congress has passed to break up this company, and the Supreme Court sides with the company. And they can't believe it. And what the Supreme Court says is, well, They are producing sugar, and this is really about distribution, and they work it out so that that law doesn't apply to this company. So the Supreme Court, and I want you to know that the courts become the protectors of property. They've always been the protectors of property. How does the Supreme Court get into their positions? Do y'all remember this? They're appointed by the president, who has to go to the Senate and get their confirmation. The Republicans have been naming these. Wealthy senators have been, wealthy corporations have been putting money on senators and presidents who name Supreme Court justices who are favorable to these big companies, right? If you control the court, if the court sides with you, then you're in a good position. Now, we don't like that idea. We like the idea that judges being impartial, right? And using something called jurisprudence. But, by the way, this prior to the Civil War, these pro-slavery movement had stacked the court. They had Southern slaveholders, New England companies that were making money on the transportation of cotton and such, and they stacked the court to protect slavery. In this case, the court is being stacked to favor the development of big businesses. So in those two ways, and in other decisions that take place, the American people's desire to regulate big business, to stop these formations, to break them up, fails, right? That's how it fails. So nothing's really happening. And the wealthy are moving forward, and the consolidations keep going.